My parents were born in a part of Ayrshire famous or infamous for coal mines and ironworks. This is my mother's family. She's the girl at the centre, the front. Her mother, Mary Donelly, is the woman on the left. Mum's father, William Donelly, is the man on the right. We called him Papa. Both William and Mary Donelly came from families that had lived in Ayrshire for generations and had worked either in the foundries or in the mines over the previous century. The boy in this photo is my dad. The chap in the bonnet is his father and my grandfather. His name is William McRae. We called him Gabby, which was as near as the first grandchild, could get to pronouncing grandpa. Gabby's family had also lived in the area for generations. That's 2 Williams already, and we haven't started yet. Sorting out all the Williams is going to be a bit of an issue. Of the 5 men in this short presentation, 4 are called William, and it gets worse in other parts of the family tree. But really this is very much part of the story. William is a Protestant name. It all goes back to this chap, King Billy, or William of Orange, and his supposedly Protestant victory at the Battle of the Boyne. In the west of Scotland, especially during the 19th and 20th centuries, doors were open to a William that were most definitely closed to a Seamus or a Sean. This is a later photo of Gabby and the first photo I could find of Gran McRae. It's their wedding anniversary. Gran mostly avoided getting her photo taken. Her father came from Aberdeenshire, so her family were the outsiders. There weren't many miners or foundry workers amongst Gran and Gabby's relatives. A lot of them had worked on farms or crofts. But by the second half of the 1800s, most of them worked on the railways. Her father was called William too. This is going to be the story of my family, from the early years of the 1800s to the early years of the 1900s. There will be a section on each of my grandparents, which will go back to their grandparents or great-grandparents. So, here are the Donellys. Papa had a namesake, William Donelly, of course, his great-grandfather. William's name is highlighted in yellow at the top right of this tree. He lived from 1821 until 1898. He was a furnaceman or furnace filler in many different ironworks throughout Ayrshire, as were his sons and grandsons. William was born in the parish of Avondale in 1821. He may well have been a child living on the Wilsontown ironworks when James Beaumont Neilson discovered the hot blast process while fixing a boiler there in 1828. The hot blast furnace was a major improvement that allowed iron to be made much more cheaply, using what was called black band ironstone, which was unusually common in west central Scotland. This is an artist's impression of what Wilsontown might have looked like a decade or so before William Donelly's birth. It's well worth stopping at this point and having a look at it in detail. There is a guide at the bottom of the picture. I have almost no information about William until he turns up in Muirkirk in January 1840, getting married to Grace Riddle. This is a very short transcript of the wedding details. He was probably living and working at Muirkirk Ironworks at the time. This is where it is relative to the rest of Scotland. Muirkirk had 3 of the 20 furnaces in Scotland in the mid-1800s, so it might have been bigger than Wilsontown in size. The area around Muirkirk was known to have good mineral reserves from very early on. A foundry was built here around the time that Wilsontown was built to the northeast. This is an item from the Morning Advertiser in 1825 when William Donelly was 4. At the time, the Morning Advertiser had a circulation second only to the Times. Grace's family seemed to have lived in Muirkirk itself, Irondale Street, and her brother is listed in the 1851 census, i.e. 10 years later, as being a grocer. William probably lived in a tied house in a workers' row right beside the foundry. The next bit of text is a description of living conditions for people living and working at ironworks at that time and for years to come. Some industries can have a positively devastating effect on the locality. I mean by this a physical effect. Take those places where iron was made, the great furnaces of Coalbrookdale, for instance. Their ever-burning fires dominated the entire countryside, belched great clouds of muck into the atmosphere. Many hundreds of people lived out their lives under such a cloud, the chemical properties of which could strip paint, corrode, blacken and decay. Think what this did to their lungs. Coke burning was another such industry. Gases given off from the coke ovens could affect vegetation up to a distance of half a mile, depending on the prevailing wind. Not only the men working at the ovens, but also their families living under this permanent cloud of gas could also be affected by really disabling pulmonary diseases. The hot blast process improved things at Muirkirk by cutting costs, but carriage to market was still expensive. In Lanarkshire, there had been investment in canals and railways in the 1830s. The railway did not come to Muirkirk until 1848. Perhaps this is why William and Grace went to Summerlee at Coatbridge, where more reliable and cheaper transport kept costs down and work was perhaps more reliable. This transcription from the 1841 census shows them living in North Row, Summerlee, with William's sister. Their son and my great-great-grandfather, Charles Donelly, just missed out on being included here. He was born in 1841, but obviously not this early. Perhaps the birth is imminent. Perhaps that is why they have William's sister, Helen, with them. I have no idea how you would make a journey from Muirkirk up to Coatbridge, which is where the Summerlee place was, in 1840. There was no railway here. Perhaps you have to go into a railway over towards Ayr and so on up here, and then come up here and then make your way across, that kind of thing. I don't know, but I don't think it can have been very easy. And this is Summerlee. They probably thought that regular work would be more certain here. If so, they soon found out they'd made a mistake. At the start of 1842, perhaps a year or so after William and Grace arrived in Summerlee, demand for Scottish iron could not keep up with supply, and the owners of the various ironworks agreed that they would all cut production by a quarter for 6 months. I can only assume that this meant a quarter of the labour would be paid off, and that since William and Grace had only just arrived, that would have been them. I don't know anything definite about them for the next 5 or 6 years, and I don't think that's coincidence. The 1840s were a very, very difficult time. There were 2 major economic downturns, and of course, as shown here, the potato famine. But I do know that in 1848 Grace had another child called Agnes, and that Agnes was born not at Coatbridge, but over here at Dalry, also called Kilbirnie. This is Agnes at 13 at the time of the 1861 census. Since there seems to be no record of her birth, this is the best guide we have to her birth details. So she seems to have been born around 1847 in Dalry. It seems that their new home was the Blair Ironworks. It had opened in Dalry in 1841, just before the slump in demand took hold. Because of the slump, it closed again in spring 1842, and it stayed shut for about a year. It seems likely then that William got a job there once it got going again, sometime in 1843 perhaps. If so, he and Grace were probably reasonably secure until the next downturn. Unfortunately, this came only 4 years later, in 1847, and by the start of 1848, the furnaces at Dalry were doused and the workers laid off. This is an advert offering the works for sale, but who is going to buy? By this time, Grace must have been pregnant, and Agnes was born later that year. Meanwhile, work was going on to create an ironworks at Dunmellington, which was in Doon Valley. Robert Burns wrote this about the Doon Valley 50 years earlier. Dunmellington is marked in red at the bottom here, so it was another journey to get there, with a baby I suppose, and goodness knows what they were doing for money. This map shows the Doon Valley more or less as Burns would have known it, although this was never the really picturesque bit. The map is later than the poem, however, and you can see that change is coming. The course of the railway is already marked in pencil. The railway was very important. Dunmellington had not been developed sooner because of the lack of ways to transport either the raw materials or the finished pig iron. By Christmas 1846, a company gambled that a railway would come. They leased the land and they started building works. 2 years later, they were producing iron. It looks like work became available here just as Dalry closed, so it would seem that William would have come here around the autumn of 1848 and would have been amongst the first workers in what was to become an enormous undertaking. The railway did not come fully until 1856, so all the time that William was there, the whole place ran on horsepower and on using heavy wagons going down to pull up lighter ones, that kind of thing. I take it this photograph of it is from a bit later, but I've used it anyway, and I've also added something that Burns wrote. Burns would no doubt have been appalled at the changes to the valley over these years, but he did know about ironworks. In 1790 or so, he had tried to visit Carron Ironworks and was refused entry. The verse that's on this photograph here is one that he apparently scratched on a window once he had failed to get in. We come na here to view your works, in hopes to be more wise, but only lest we gang to hell, it may be nae surprise. By the 1851 census, the Donelly family, now including a third child born in Muirkirk the previous year, were all definitely in Dunmellington. But conditions were about as bad as they could be. This is a report from around that time. This photograph shows Dunmellington some time later. Again, there's a key underneath. And this is a transcript of the 1851 census. I'm going to start concentrating more on Charles Donelly from now on. Charles was William and Grace's eldest son and my great-great-grandfather. And since I moved on to him, I'm going to start referring to William as Old William to distinguish him from the other Williams involved here. Anyway, this is Charles at 9 years old in Dunmellington. This is definitely the correct family. Grace was christened Grizal, which was apparently quite a common thing, and then people were called Grace. And the name Grizal may have confused the copier, but this is them. Charles is listed as a scholar, but I don't think he would have been at school very often, and if he did go, he didn't learn much. We'll find out more about that later. The family might have left Millington soon after. In 1851, a new furnace had been installed in Eglinton Foundry in Kilwinning, and that's where they went next. William and Grace were there when their fourth child was born in 1855. I've marked Kilwinning in red towards the left top of this map. Finally, they seem to have found a place where a life of some kind was possible, although from the next slide's description, which was written not long afterwards, it doesn't really sound like it. In the end, they had 7 surviving children, of whom 4 were born in Kilwinning in the 9 years between 1855 and 1864. This is a description of living conditions at Eglinton. It maybe explains why, of 230 deaths registered in Kilwinning parish in 1873, 77 were of children 5 years old or younger, and 64 were of children 2 years old and younger. In 1863, Charles Donelly married Jane Hopkirk in Kilwinning. This is the marriage certificate. They married in August at 6 Double Row, Eglinton. Marrying in August was maybe a bit unusual. The standard thing was to get married at the new year, but marrying at home was certainly the norm, and this was probably Jane's parents' house. What is surprising is that neither of them were able to sign the marriage certificate properly. Both had to make an X for a mark and have that witnessed. And I think that's a clear indication of how poor schooling was during their childhood. The woman that Charles married was Jane Hopkirk. Jane and Charles are my great-great-grandparents. Jane was born in Largs, but her family had come from the Borders. Jane's grandfather was a shoemaker. Her father, William Hopkirk, set out to become a weaver, but he was a bit late. Mechanised weaving machines were changing the position of handloom weavers from the best paid craftsmen to the worst. Weaving was not a good choice. William was still a weaver the year he married Jane's mother, who was called Jane, in Largs in 1841. This was just after the 1841 census, and he described himself as a weaver in the census. Then, in 1843, William the weaver's mother died. William and his wife left Largs not long after. They were still there when Jane was born in 1844, but William's father remarried in 1846. By 1849, possibly much earlier, William and Jean had moved to Kilwinning. This census record shows the Hopkirk family at the time of the 1851 census. William the weaver is now William the miner. You wonder what he made of his first few months down the pit and living in a miner's row. His life in Largs must surely have been a lot more comfortable. But this explains Jane's illiteracy. Both she and Charles went to school at a time and place where the chaotic change was such that virtually no school learning took place. Having said that, plenty of people who could not write were able to read well enough. William and Jane eventually had many children. 8 of them survived the first few months. Sadly, only 3 of the 8 reached adulthood. This is the family in 1861, 2 years before Charles and Jane married. Jane is no longer with them. As a furnaceman or furnace filler, Charles would have probably felt himself to be a bit superior to a miner or a miner's daughter, and Jane might have felt that she had moved up a notch in the social ladder. On the other hand, Jane came from a family of artisans who would not have expected that their son or grandson would become a miner.